It hasn't been that long since Bloomburrow graced our presence on the Magic the Gathering tables across the land, but it's already Duskmourn season, and the only thing scarier than the previews and the lack of inclusion of Betrayal at House of the Hill IP into the set is the fact that there are plenty of cards coming out that could have impact on the Pioneer format. Now, there are a lot of cards out there that people are hopeful for, and some of them that I think are going to fall a little bit flat below expectations. So this is going to be my list of the studs, the duds, and the Could-Ofs from Duskmourn. Now, before we dive into my entire list, I do like to put a little bit of a disclaimer at the beginning of these videos because I am making this list late into the spoiler season and do have the benefit of having seen some other lists and seen other people talk about the cards. I've also had a chance to talk to other players and friends a lot more than some of the other creators that put them up as soon as the full spoiler was released. So this list is not meant to like one up or put down any other sort of lists whatsoever. It's just me taking my time, which gives me the hindsight when these other lists do grace the front page of Reddit. And of course, I read a lot of the players' lists out there and am subscribed to other content creators as well. There's no ill intent towards anybody's opinions, and these that you're going to see in the video are just mine before the format gets released. I also just want to go out on a limb and say that I honestly don't think that Duskmourn is a very Pioneer powered up set. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't have its cards that I think we'll see play, but overall, I think this format is going to be a little less affected than things like Standard from this set release, and I'm really excited to see things, how they impact in Standard, but since Pioneer is the majority of the videos I do on here, we are going to be talking about all of these cards from a Pioneer perspective, so don't take it to mean that I think it's not going to see play somewhere else, it's just for Pioneer. So let's kick things off with the duds. Now, these are cards that I've seen some sort of hype around, whether it be from the community, other content creators' lists, or from chatting with players in person and playing against them. These cards, I feel like, miss the mark in some way, shape, or form from the Pioneer format, despite all of that hype surrounding them. The first dud that I want to talk about from Duskmourn is going to be something that nobody wanted: Unwanted Remake. This card looks like Path to Exile, but plays like Reality Shift. Manifest Dread is a detriment against creature deaths because it risks upgrading what you remove, and playing a card like Get Lost and just removing the effect in the creature entirely is much better for just one additional mana. Now, while this does give them just a vanilla 2/2 that you can deal with in combat, and Get Lost gives them map tokens that could potentially give them some cards in hand or fix their mana, I do think that giving them map tokens in general is much better to accidentally flipping them into a Sheoldred when you're removing a Blood Tithe Harvester. This card could maybe see play in some tempo decks like the Azorius Spirits deck, but Portable Hole, Slip Out the Back, all those types of effects are much better when it comes to the damage race in a tempo style match like those. Another dud of a card that we'll have to see if it falls flat is Abhorrent Oculus. No, I do not think this card is good in Izzet Phoenix. It has anti-synergies with the deck's main game plan involving Arclight Phoenix, and it clashes with Delve on cards like Treasure Cruise. This is also worse than Young Pyromancer alongside sideboard cards like Crackling Drake, even though those spells you exile do count towards the Drake's power. Getting the spells matter part from Young Pyromancer will often give you multiple things on the battlefield in a turn, and normally you just need these to block or chip away damage rather than be threats in and of themselves. Now, this could see play in a Soulflayer or Neoform style deck as a plan B, but it's also at odds in those decks because it eats the graveyard, and that's what those decks want to use, whether it's for Delve or enabling keywords on their Soulflayer. This also dies to a Fatal Push with Revolt, so it's not great in and of itself. A super flavorful card that I don't think has the right applications in Pioneer is Hedge Shredder. A lot of people think that Hedge Shredder is this bonkers card for Greasefang decks, but I don't quite see it. Pound for pound, it's worse than Asika's Chariot, impacts the board less, and worse when they're bringing in graveyard hate in games 2 and 3. Now, you want this type of card to be crewed by like Elvish Mystic or Llanowar Elves over Rafine's Informants, so I would use this in a Gruul or Selesnya shell as sort of like a Cultivator's Caravan type ramp card that can help me hit Delirium in the process for cards that care about that, not trying to make rats fly giant planes. Something that I don't think you need to feel for this dud of a card is fear of missing out. Now, this is one that I thought was good when it was first spoiled, specifically for Mardu Greasefang lovers, but it's probably just not good enough. You can maybe get people with the second combat phase, but getting this with Delirium and the Greasefang combo naturally on turn 3 for an instant combo kill is extremely hard. Your best bet is to be going Stitcher Supplier, and then FOMO needs to hit another FOMO, a vehicle, and 2 other non-creature cards in those 4 spells that you mill over, just to keep Delirium that turn for fear of missing out to have the second combat enabled, and for Greasefang on turn 3 to bring that artifact out of your graveyard while still keeping the Delirium count up. This is just a little too RNG even for me. And the last dud on my list from Duskmourn is gonna be a human card. It's Veteran Survivor. Now, I saw hopeful thoughts about this card as a 2/1 human 1-drop that can even get larger after a couple of turns of swinging on in, but I don't think this card has a home in mono white or Orzhov humans decks. Cards like Mardu Woe Ripper never saw play as a hate card, and while this can eventually grow, the human decks are often on a clock to close games out, where Hopeful Initiate is a far superior card thanks to training, alongside counters being put on your creatures thanks to Luminarch Aspirant. Not to mention, the Initiate itself can destroy opposing Witches' Ovens, Leyline Bindings, if you play it later on, temporary lockdowns, so there's just a lot more utility to that 1-drop over the Veteran Survivor. Alright, with some of the duds out of the way, let's talk about the studs. These are cards that I feel for sure are going to be seeing play in the Pioneer format. That means they could slot into existing top tier decks, or the cards themselves might be powerful enough to take something along the lines of a tier 2 deck and move it up into the spotlight for the format. These cards are powerful enough on their own, or they just slot into existing synergies that have been proven to have results previously in the format. Number 5 on my studs list, we're going to kick it off with Shardmage's Rescue. With Gruul and more recently Rakdos being the prowess or heroic type decks of choice, a white splash version of the deck needs something a little extra to push it through in power level. Shardmage's Rescue, effectively turning something like an Illuminator Virtuoso into a Boggle for a turn, could be the reason to play white. A couple of more aura synergies might even be enough to shift the white colored heroic decks towards the auras style deck with ethereal armor and all that glitters again, giving SRAM decks their first buff since the Light Paws print came out. This could also go with Optimistic Scavenger, which is another new card from Duskmourn, to act as like a Luminarch Aspirant for Enchantments Matter decks. Coming in at stud number 4, I hope I say its name right or it might kill me, Valgavoth, Terror Eater. This ward cost is giving Vein Ripper flashbacks. Now this target can be transmogrified or creativity into as well, since it's not a vampire, Soren's not here, and we're stuck with the demon creature type. So that's probably how we're cheating this card into play over some sort of reanimation effect. Turns the opponent's non-answers into card advantage, or you get to steal their own threats as well. Similar but weaker to Gristlebrand, which is probably the closest big other demon comparison we can make, this card does need to survive a turn to really have a payoff, and it is still weak to edict effects like a Shielded Edict on an empty board besides itself, or Blot Out, which was the Vein Ripper answer as well. However, this does shut off Dies triggers, which is super relevant versus decks like the Rakdos Prowess deck or the Sacrifice decks at the moment. Stud number 3 was something that I always facepalmed at when I heard it on Scooby-Doo. Let's split up, gang! Now, goofiness in the name aside, this is a powerful sweeper, especially at 3 mana. The threat of this combined with other sweeper cards like Settle the Wreckage and Sunfall is going to make attacking for smaller amounts of damage a nightmare for aggro and mid-range decks. Now, the best part about this card, in my opinion, for Azorius control decks or mono white control decks, if that's your style of play, is how nicely this pairs with the Wandering Emperor, since the vigilance on the samurai tokens means that this can be a one-sided board wipe for you. And if you're a super deep brewer, try this alongside Always Watching in a Caretaker's Talent package for maximum amounts of value. All I'm gonna say is the existence of this card makes me glad that Teferi Time Raveler is banned. Number 2 on the list of my studs, it's a reprint, Pyroclasm. Probably one of the most impactful spells we've had reprinted into the format in a while, Pyroclasm houses Boros Convoke as a single Loxodon does not let its tokens survive this sweeper. Now, this is also somewhat decent into Prowess, although the Valiant triggers help survive this. Prowess in and of itself can pump things toughness as well, so holding a pump spell can save a Swift Spear or other X2s with Prowess. And Monstrous Rage in and of itself will save a Slick Shot Show-Off. So this is not as powerful against those decks, can still put some fear in those decks to play slower, and it's still just really good against any sort of Llanowar Elf or Elvish Mystic based deck. Number 1 on my list of studs from Duskmourn, it's a little bit of a cheaty one, it's actually a bunch of cards, it's the Verge Land Cycle. This land cycle is a big upgrade to pathways in the decks that can use them, as they create both colors of mana efficiently and fast. Now, these are a little bit worse with less or no basics, but the shock lands and surveil lands are going to help these out a ton by having those basic land types. Now, the Rakdos, aka Blazemire Verge, and Dimir one, aka Gloomlake Verge, are fantastic because of the mana that they produce when they first come into play. Blazemire producing black, so you can Fatal Push and Thoughtseize, and Gloomlake Verge producing blue, so if you're playing a control shell, you can keep up Spell Pierce type effects and Consider at the same time. The rest of them are still good, but are a little bit more limiting into the types of decks that they can go into. For example, Flood Farm Verge, the Azorius land, does not tap for blue turn 1, it taps for white, so you can't hold up those same control-y type spells like the Dimir one can. And the Gruul land, which is Thornspire Verge, doesn't tap for green on turn 1, which means that this cannot put out either Llanowar Elf or Elvish Mystic right away. Instead, this is going to have to be powering up more Naya or Selesnya based Monodork decks, as Hushwood Verge, the Selesnya land, produces green first and then white later on if you just have a forest or plains in play. Now, I do want to talk about a couple of my Could-Ofs. Well, these are my honorable mentions, but Could-Ofs sounds better when you say it with studs, duds, Could-Ofs, you know, YouTube title kind of shenanigans. But this time around, there are a lot of cards in the set that have potential and got me a little bit excited, but I don't think they're going to have the proper home in an existing Pioneer archetype, or them themselves just might not be powerful enough to take those kind of tier 3 and 2 archetypes and really turn them into powerhouses in the format, or to see play in the competitive levels of the format. These cards you could probably play at your LGS's F&M, but I wouldn't expect them to be at the top tables at an RCQ or being represented at the RC in just a little bit. At the top of my Could-Ofs, I'm actually going to be putting the Overlord Avatar cycle of cards. These are kind of like the titans of the set. There's one for each mono color in the format, and they're all kind of varying power levels. So I kind of group them together into the maybe slot, because I don't think they're all going to see play, but maybe like one of them does. Overlord of the Hauntwoods looks great because the land automatically gives you domain, and it slots in very nicely in the Enigmatic Fires deck, because if you play it as an impending cost for 3, it immediately ramps you into 5, so when you slam down Fires next turn, you can start playing larger than 4 drops off of that extra spell cast. The Overlord of Boiler Bilges, the red one, it's a removal spell, so it deals 4 damage and can kind of deal with something, so it's like mediocre at best, but the best part about it is a 6 mana card that does eventually turn into a 7 drop, again for that Enigmatic Incarnation deck, where you could potentially find an Atraxa or a Titan of Industry type card at the top of your curve. From there, things kind of go downhill a little bit. Overlord of the Mistmoors makes tokens, and even though it's very Grave Titan-esque, I don't think that Grave Titan is powerful enough for this current Pioneer format, at least with the tools we have to put it into play ahead of schedule. Things like Transmogrify and Indomitable Creativity already have access to cards like Atraxa or Valgavoth now from this set, which I think do a lot better than putting Mistmoors into play. And Fires can have this as a target, but it doesn't really upgrade into anything, and it's going to be at the top of its curve. So you're not really going to be able to turn this into like an 8 or 9 drop because there aren't powerful enough cards to Enigmatic Incarnation into off of this. Instead, you kind of be playing this, getting some tokens, and turning it into the things you'd find off of the Boiler Bilges one anyway. So it's not really worth slotting into your deck over like a Kenrith or a Tolsimir or a Bonnie Paul or something that the lists are running currently. And then the last couple of ones, Baelmerk and Floodpits, I don't quite think are Pioneer power level. Drawing cards is always pretty cool, but the rate that you have and the fact that there's only 3 toughness on Floodpits just kind of makes it the worst of the bunch. And Baelmerk may surprise me, being able to put something from your graveyard into your hand more recursively, but I don't think it's an effect that the decks that want to play a high cost enchantment like Enigmatic Fires or something, I keep saying that one because these are all enchantments and it's the prime deck for that. I don't think they're going to want to run this mono black enchantment card that doesn't necessarily synergize with the rest of their deck. Undead Sprinter might be worth it alongside Cat Oven and some of the sacrifice decks, but with how the Yeager combo is popping off now and all the sort of redundancy and long game that combo has to offer, I don't necessarily know if we're going to be seeing this card in those types of lists. There are some sort of fringe decks, especially at my LGS, that I do wind up seeing, like the Dredgy style decks, that this is a great enabler alongside Prized Amalgam, but Dredge lacks a lot of things to really make it powerful in the Pioneer format, and with a ton of exile removal existing in the format, it's not exactly powerful enough. Plus, the Undead Sprinter in and of itself is really bad into Unlicensed Hearse and a lot of the graveyard hate that is being played in the format now, because Sacrifice and Phoenix are both top presence decks. Balustrade Wurm, if I'm saying that one properly, is an interesting card because it's a 5/5 for 5 that can't be countered. It has trample and it has haste. So this block of text on the card has shades of Questing Beast to it. And while that card itself didn't do too much of anything in the format, this one can recur itself with Delirium, which makes it a must exile if your deck can enable Delirium at all. Groove Vehicles, if that deck is still floating around in some way, shape, or form, or Abzan Greasefang, may look at this card as a sideboard option if control-y or more powerful mid-range control style decks like Niv to Light are still extremely popular at the tables. Toby, Beastie, Befriender is probably a bit more of a standard power level player than Pioneer, but Toby gives me big Blade Splicer vibes and slots in great alongside Caretaker's talent in those tokens matter style of decks. It's easy to hit the flying stipulation with Caretaker's talent decks, and it plays extremely well with Anthems. So any way to blink Toby as well to get more 4/4s because they're not legendary is very, very powerful. But the problem is Toby needs a specific shell that might not quite be Pioneer power level, as Yorion is one way to blink it, but you're kind of lacking tools like Ephemerate and Modern. Norin Swift Survivalist is an interesting inclusion in this Could-Ofs list, but a legendary 2/1 for 1 mana can't be overlooked. Yeah, Norin's no Ragavan, but being both a human and a way to turn on Mox Amber could be a big deal for decks like Legends or the Bard class decks, which do see Fringe and for funsies play. Norin also has a splash effect in the mono red prowess or any red based prowess deck as a way to save their creatures in combat when you're trying to force bad blocks, and a way to cancel lifelink effects when you're being the aggressor. Screaming Nemesis just reads as unblockable versus Angels or any other style of deck that relies on getting a high life total. It's a Skyclave Apparition magnet versus those decks, but might be too much mana to matter once they start gaining some life and making some Angel tokens. It works good in the Prowess or Heroics decks, however, because Reckless Rage is able to deal damage to it while removing an opposing creature. However, so that kind of makes this a little sideboard playable in my head. Clockwork Percussionist is a brand new toy for not just the Boros Convoke deck, but also the Is It in Soul deck, because this is a 1-drop artifact. Like Unlucky Witness, but it trades in seeing 2 cards just for having this artifact subtype. It's great alongside Shrapnel Blast to dig a card deeper, and could just replace Combat Courier in some of those lists as a way to get an extra card faster. Lastly, I do want to mention Floodpits Drowner. Now, this one might just be a little bit biased because of my friend and co-caster Kyle, who plays Simic Merfolk in every format he could possibly play, but it seems to be an upgrade over Merfolk Trickster for damage racing specifically. It doesn't necessarily deal with those Sheoldred type cards being able to remove abilities like Trickster can, but the upside is that if you have any sort of way to flicker this or cast more of them, you can kind of chain removal spells on things by putting the counters on different things and removing them in order of how important they are to get rid of after they've been tapped down. Flash on this is especially huge, so I think that this could be a creature replacement for cards like Eaten by Piranhas that are used in the Pioneer Merfolk decks. So that's my overall take on studs, duds, and could-ofs for the Pioneer format out of Duskmourn. However, like I said, this format seems to be a little bit of a lower power level even compared to Bloomburrow just a little while ago. So if there are any cards that you think I have misread or cards that you think I should have mentioned that I didn't, let me know down in the comments below. And while you're down there, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, even if you disagree with the list, because Duskmourn seems to be pretty cool, even though the thematics of it seem to be a little bit polarizing for people. As always, you can also tap that subscribe button if you want to stay up to date on my latest deck techs, metagame analysis, and just in general Magic content. Happy haunting!